Zefkar stood at the observation deck of Nexus Prime, watching the human transport ship dock with obvious disgust. His crystalline skin caught the station's artificial light as he shifted his weight from one armored foot to the other. The Valtorian military advisor had seen many species come and go through these docking bays, but none annoyed him quite like humans. The transport ship called New Liberty looked ancient compared to the sleek vessels of other civilized races. Its hull showed scorch marks and patches where repairs had been made with inferior metals. Zefkar shook his head and accessed the personnel files through his neural implant. The data made him even more disappointed. Captain Jake Miller, the file read, was 32 years old and had served in various human conflicts. The photo showed a man with short brown hair and calm eyes. Nothing impressive. No natural armor plating. No enhanced bone structure. No telepathic abilities listed. Just another soft human pretending to be a soldier. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was a communications specialist. Her file mentioned quick thinking and problem-solving skills, but Zefkar dismissed this as typical human exaggeration. How could beings who still needed primitive vocal cords to communicate possibly understand real military coordination? His own people shared thoughts instantly across vast distances. Sergeant Pete Johnson commanded the heavy weapons unit. The man looked relaxed in his photo, almost lazy. Zefkar had seen Thraxian warriors who could lift battle tanks with their bare hands. This human probably struggled with his own equipment weight. Private Lisa Chong was barely 20 years old and looked even younger in her picture. The file called her eager and intelligent. But Zefkar saw only another weak creature that would probably cry at the first sign of real danger. The docking bay doors opened with a loud hiss. Zefkar watched through the transparent walls as the human soldiers emerged from their ship. They moved in formation, but their steps seemed so light, so fragile. Their armor looked like metalkins wrapped around children's bodies. They carried weapons that seemed primitive compared to the energy rifles used by proper military forces. Captain Miller walked to the front of his unit, scanning the docking bay with alert eyes. Zefkar noticed a human's head turning constantly, taking in details of the station's layout. This observation habit was something Zefkar recognized from other species, but he assumed humans did it poorly. The Valtorian descended from the observation deck to meet the arriving forces. His crystalline feet clicked against a metal floor as he approached. Other alien officers were also gathering, tall Meridians with their blue skin and 4 arms, stocky Gornaks with their thick hides, and elegant ethereals who seemed to float rather than walk. "Welcome to Nexus Prime," announced Commander Vextar, a Meridian who led the Joint Operations Center. "You have all been selected for the defense of Kepler, 442b mining colony." Zefkar listened as the commander explained the situation. The hegemony fleet was approaching the Outer Rim, threatening several important resource worlds. Kepler 442b produced rare metals needed for faster-than-light engines. If it fell to the hegemony, the entire sector will be vulnerable. The enemy fleet will arrive in approximately 1 week. Commander Vextar continued. "We must establish defensive positions and hold the mining colony until reinforcements arrive." Captain Miller stepped forward slightly. "Sir, we'll need detailed maps of the colony and surrounding terrain. Also data on local weather patterns and geological stability." Zefkar almost laughed out loud. Geological stability? What did rock formations matter when plasma cannons were firing overhead? The human was already showing his primitive thinking. Lieutenant Rodriguez raised her hand. "Commander, what communication systems are available on the planet? Will we have full orbital relay coverage?" Another useless question, Zefkar thought. Real warriors use telepathic links that couldn't be jammed or intercepted. These humans and their obsession with primitive radio signals. Sergeant Johnson spoke next. "What's the enemy's preferred assault pattern? Do they favor orbital bombardment or ground invasion?" Zefkar considered this question slightly more intelligent, but still basic. Any experienced military mind already knew the hegemony's tactics from previous battles. Young Private Chong surprised everyone by asking, "Are there any native life forms on the planet that might affect combat operations? Underground creatures or plant life that reacts to energy weapons?" This question caught Zefkar off guard. Why would a soldier care about local animals? The Valtorian dismissed it as another example of human weakness, caring too much about insignificant details. Commander Vextar seemed pleased with the questions and promised full briefing materials within 6 hours. As the meeting broke up, Zefkar approached his assigned planning station. His task was to create the defensive strategy that would save Kepler 442b. The Valtorian spread holographic displays across his workspace, showing the mining colony from every angle. The facility sat in a mountain valley, surrounded by steep cliffs on 3 sides. A single approach road connected it to the main spaceport. The tactical situation seemed simple enough. Zefkar began placing defensive positions on the map. Heavy weapons on the cliff tops could control the valley floor. Shield generators would protect the main buildings. Fighter squadrons would patrol the upper atmosphere. He felt confident in his planned superiority. As he worked, Zefkar noticed the human soldiers setting up their own planning area nearby. They spread paper maps alongside their electronic displays, actual paper like primitive beings. Captain Miller pointed at various locations while his team took notes with physical writing instruments. Their discussion was conducted in spoken words rather than efficient thought-sharing. Zefkar could hear fragments of their conversation as his universal translator processed their crude language. The western approach has better cover, Miller was saying. Supply lines look vulnerable here, Rodriguez pointed out. Enemy could use these ridges for artillery positions, Johnson added. These caves might connect underground, Chang suggested. Zefkar found their primitive methods amusing. While they wasted time with verbal communication and paper maps, he was designing a sophisticated defense using advanced tactical algorithms. His crystalline mind could process multiple battle scenarios simultaneously. These humans probably couldn't even think about more than one thing at a time. The Valtorian completed his preliminary defense plan within 2 hours. The strategy relied on superior firepower and strong fixed positions. Any competent military force could execute it successfully. He felt satisfied with his efficient work. Looking over at the human planning area, Zefkar saw them still discussing basic details. They had covered their table with maps, charts, and data sheets. Captain Miller was sketching something by hand while his team members asked questions. Their slow, inefficient process confirmed everything Zefkar believed about human limitations. Tomorrow would bring the formal strategy presentation to all unit commanders. Zefkar looked forward to demonstrating proper military planning to these inferior beings. Perhaps they might even learn something useful, though he doubted their primitive minds could grasp advanced tactical concepts. The Valtorian stored his completed plan in the station's central computer and prepared to return to his quarters. As he walked past the human work area, he overheard Captain Miller saying something about alternate escape routes and backup communication methods. Typical human paranoia, Zefkar thought, always planning for failure instead of focusing on victory. This attitude explained why their species remained weak despite their recent entry into galactic civilization. The briefing tomorrow would surely expose the vast difference between proper military thinking and human amateur tactics. The joint briefing room buzzed with activity as representatives from 6 different species gathered around the central holographic display. Zefkar stood confidently at the presentation controls, his crystalline armor reflecting the blue light from the tactical projections. Today he would show everyone, especially the humans, what real military strategy looked like. Commander Vextar called for attention as the room settled. Strategic Advisor Zefkar will present our defensive plan for Kepler 442b. Zefkar activated the holographic display, showing the mining colony in perfect three-dimensional detail. The mountain valley spread before them, with the facility buildings clustered near the center and steep cliffs rising on 3 sides. The tactical situation is straightforward. Zefkar began, using his natural telepathic abilities to share confidence and authority with the other non-human officers. The enemy must approach through the single valley entrance. We place our heavy weapons here, here, and here. Red markers appeared on the cliff tops, showing weapon emplacements that could fire down into the valley. Shield generators form protective domes over the main buildings. Fighter patrol routes crisscross the airspace above. Our artillery controls the high ground. Enemy forces entering the valley will be caught in crossfire with no escape routes. The shield generators protect our vital facilities, while our fighters prevent orbital bombardment. This strategy guarantees victory. Several alien officers nodded approvingly. The Gornak commander grunted his satisfaction with the heavy weapon placements. The ethereal representative praised the elegant simplicity of the defensive positions. Zefkar felt pleased with the positive reactions. His plan was clearly superior to anything these primitive species could devise. He glanced toward the human section of the room, expecting to see impressed expressions. Instead, Captain Miller was studying the holographic display with a slight frown. Lieutenant Rodriguez was taking notes on her primitive paper pad. Sergeant Johnson had his arms crossed, looking thoughtful. Private Chong was actually sketching something in a notebook. "Are there any questions about the strategy?" Zefkar asked, certain that his plan was too well designed to need improvement. Captain Miller raised his hand politely. "Sir, could we review the detailed terrain data for the area? Specifically the geological survey information." Zefkar felt slightly irritated, but activated the geological overlay. The holographic display now showed rock formations, underground spaces, and soil composition throughout the valley. Miller studied the new information carefully. His eyes moved from point to point across the display, following patterns that Zefkar couldn't understand. After several minutes, the human captain looked up. "There are 3 issues with the current defensive layout," Miller said quietly. "First, these weapon positions on the eastern cliff have no coverage of this depression here. Enemy forces could use it for protected approach." Zefkar looked at the area Miller indicated. There was indeed a small valley within the larger valley, hidden from the eastern artillery positions. But surely enemy forces would be too disorganized to find such minor terrain features. "Second," Miller continued, "the supply lines to these cliff-top positions are completely exposed to enemy fire from the northern ridges. Once the battle begins, resupplying those weapons will be impossible." The Valtorian checked his tactical display. The supply routes did cross open ground that could be observed from several directions, but he had assumed the enemy would be too busy with the main assault to worry about supply interdiction. Third, the enemy's known preference for a tunnel assault isn't addressed. They've used underground approaches in their last 4 major engagements. This limestone geology shows extensive natural cave systems that connect to the valley floor. Zefkar stared at the geological data. The cave networks were clearly visible now that Miller had pointed them out. How had he missed such obvious tunnel routes? His crystalline mind processed thousands of tactical variables simultaneously, yet somehow these underground passages had escaped his notice. "These observations are interesting," Zefkar said carefully, "but the enemy has no prior knowledge of this specific location. They cannot have prepared tunnel positions in advance." Lieutenant Rodriguez looked up from her notes. "Sir, intelligence reports show hegemony scout ships in this sector 3 months ago. Survey duration was 17 days, plenty of time for advanced preparation." The communications specialist was correct. Zefkar had reviewed the same intelligence reports, but had focused on fleet movements rather than individual scout activities. The possibility of advanced tunnel construction hadn't occurred to him. Additionally, Sergeant Johnson added, "if we place all our heavy weapons on fixed positions, we lose tactical flexibility. Mobile defense allows repositioning based on actual enemy approach routes." Zefkar felt his confidence wavering. Mobile defense was more complex than fixed positions, requiring constant communication and coordination between units. His original plan had assumed that superior firepower from prepared positions would be enough. Private Chong spoke for the first time during the briefing. "The local ecosystem data shows underground water systems that could flood some cave networks. If we map the water table, we might be able to seal tunnel approaches." The young human had identified a defensive option that Zefkar had never considered. Using natural water systems as military obstacles was innovative thinking that went beyond standard tactical doctrine. Commander Vextar looked between Zefkar and the human officers. "These are valid points. Can a defensive plan be modified to address these concerns?" Zefkar felt embarrassed, but tried to maintain professional composure. "Of course. I will incorporate these suggestions into a revised strategy." The briefing concluded with assignments for the various species units. As the room emptied, Zefkar remained the holographic display, staring at the terrain data that had revealed his oversights. Captain Miller approached the Valtorian officer. "Sir, we'd be happy to assist with a tactical revision if you'd like additional perspectives." The human's tone was respectful, showing no arrogance or superiority despite having identified major flaws in Zefkar's plan. This professional courtesy somehow made the Valtorian feel worse about his initial dismissal of human capabilities. "That won't be necessary," Zefkar replied stiffly. "I can handle the modifications myself." Miller nodded and gathered his team. As the humans left the briefing room, Zefkar heard them discussing deployment preparations. Their conversation covered equipment checks, communication protocols, and coordination procedures. They spoke with the casual efficiency of experienced soldiers. Over the next 6 hours, Zefkar worked to revise his defensive strategy. The modifications were more complex than he had anticipated. Accounting for tunnel approaches required repositioning most of the artillery. Mobile defense concepts demanded flexible communication networks. Underground water mapping needed geological expertise he didn't possess. The revised plan that emerged was substantially different from his original design. Many of the human suggestions had proven essential for effective defense. Zefkar felt frustrated that beings he considered primitive had identified problems that his advanced tactical training had missed. The joint force departed for Kepler, 442b the following day. During the 3-day journey, Zefkar observed the human soldiers as they prepared for combat. They maintained their equipment with careful attention to detail. They practiced coordination drills using verbal commands instead of telepathic links. They studied local terrain and weather data with methodical thoroughness. Most surprising to Zefkar was their attitude toward the mission. The humans showed no fear of the approaching battle, but neither did they display overconfidence. They prepared professionally for both success and failure, creating backup plans for various contingencies. When the transport ships reached Kepler, 442b, the mixed species force immediately began establishing defensive positions. Zefkar watched as Sergeant Johnson efficiently organized supply caches and locations that provided both protection and accessibility. The human had somehow identified optimal storage sites that balanced multiple tactical requirements. Lieutenant Rodriguez set up communication networks that connected all species units despite their different technological standards. Her primitive radio systems actually proved more reliable in the planet's electromagnetic environment than some of the more advanced alien communication methods. Private Chong spent hours studying soil samples and underground water flows, mapping potential tunnel flooding points with scientific precision. Her geological knowledge seemed far beyond what Zefkar expected from a basic infantry soldier. Captain Miller coordinated the overall defensive setup with calm efficiency. He moved between alien units, communicating through translators while ensuring that each species' capabilities were properly integrated into the defensive plan. By the end of the first day, Zefkar had to admit that the humans were contributing more to the defensive preparations than he had anticipated. Their attention to practical details and backup planning created a more robust defense than his original strategy had provided. Still, the Valtorian convinced himself that these were minor contributions. When the real fighting began, superior alien capabilities would prove decisive. The humans might be adequate support personnel, but they would hardly be the heroes of this battle. The enemy fleet was still 2 days away, and strange energy readings had begun appearing on the planet sensors. Something felt wrong about the tactical situation, but Zefkar couldn't identify the specific threat. Soon enough, they would all discover just how wrong his assumptions about human soldiers really were. The first explosions came from beneath the mining facility at 0347 hours, catching everyone completely by surprise. Zefkar was thrown from his sleeping platform as the ground shook violently. Emergency alarms screamed through the defensive compound as soldiers from 6 different species scrambled to their positions. Contact report. Commander Vexstar's voice crackled over the communication system. All units report status. Zefkar rushed to the tactical center, his crystalline armor catching sparks from damaged electrical systems. The holographic displays showed chaos throughout the mining complex. Red indicators marked explosions in 3 separate locations, all inside the defensive perimeter that was supposed to be secure. Hegemony forces emerging from tunnel systems, reported a Gornak officer. Multiple breach points in sectors 4, 7, and 9. The Valtorian stared at the tactical display in shock. The enemy wasn't supposed to arrive for 2 more days. The defensive positions he had carefully planned were designed to stop attacks from outside the valley, not from underneath the facility itself. Through the transparent walls of the command center, Zefkar could see hegemony soldiers pouring out of hidden tunnel entrances. The insectoid aliens moved in perfect coordination, their chitinous armor gleaming under the facility's emergency lighting. They had clearly been preparing this assault for months. All units, implement Defense Plan Alpha, Commander Vextar ordered. Artillery units, target the tunnel entrances. But the artillery positions on the cliff tops couldn't angle their weapons low enough to hit targets inside the facility. The shield generators designed to protect against orbital bombardment were useless against enemies already inside the perimeter. Zefkar's careful defensive strategy was becoming a death trap for his own forces. Panic spread through the mixed species units as soldiers tried to reach defensive positions that were now behind enemy lines. Meridian officers attempted to coordinate through telepathic links, but the underground stone interfered with their mental communications. Gornak warriors charged toward the tunnel entrances, only to be cut down by hegemony energy weapons in the narrow corridors. Command center is compromised. Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice cut through the communication chaos. Human units are falling back to secondary positions. Zefkar watched through the tactical displays as the human soldiers moved with surprising coordination. While other species units struggled to adapt to the unexpected situation, the humans seemed to have anticipated this exact scenario. Captain Miller's voice came over the radio system. All units, this is Miller. Enemy has control of main facility. Recommend immediate withdrawal to prepared fallback positions. Human units will cover the retreat. Prepared fallback positions? Commander Vextar asked. What fallback positions? Check your tactical displays, sir. Lieutenant Rodriguez replied calmly. We established secondary defensive lines yesterday evening. All Allied units had withdrawal routes marked in green. Zefkar looked at his display in amazement. Green lines now appeared throughout the tactical map, showing safe retreat paths from every major position. When had the humans created these routes? More importantly, how had they known to prepare for this specific type of attack? The Valtorian watched his human soldiers move through the facility with practiced efficiency. Sergeant Johnson led a team through maintenance tunnels that Zefkar hadn't even known existed, setting explosive charges to slow the enemy advance. The heavy weapons expert seemed to know exactly where to place his demolitions for maximum effect. Private Chong appeared on one of the security cameras, moving through ventilation systems that were too small for larger alien species. She carried a portable sensor package that was providing real-time intelligence about enemy positions and movements. Chong to command. Her voice whispered over the radio. Enemy has at least 300 soldiers already inside the facility. Main force is still coming up from deeper tunnels. They're heading for the reactor core. The reactor core, if the hegemony took control of the facility's power source, they could either shut down all defensive systems or overload the reactor to destroy everything within 50 kilometers. Zefkar realized that his defensive plan had left this critical location essentially unguarded. All units. Priority target is reactor complex. Commander Vextar ordered. Prevent enemy access at all costs. Negative, sir, Captain Miller replied. Reactor complex is already compromised. Recommend controlled evacuation while we implement Contingency Protocol 7. What is Contingency Protocol 7? Zefkar demanded. Emergency reactor shutdown and facility lockdown, Lieutenant Rodriguez explained. We identified the scenario during initial planning. Full lockdown will contain the enemy but requires all personnel to evacuate to minimum safe distance. The humans had planned for the complete loss of the mining facility. While Zefkar had focused on holding fixed positions, they had prepared for multiple levels of tactical failure. Their primitive backup planning was proving essential for survival. Over the next hour, Zefkar watched the human soldiers coordinate a fighting withdrawal that saved hundreds of alien lives. They moved through the facility with confidence that could only come from extensive preparation and training. Sergeant Johnson's demolition work created choke points that slowed enemy advances. His explosive charges were placed with surgical precision, collapsing tunnels in ways that blocked hegemony forces without endangering Allied units. Lieutenant Rodriguez maintained communication between all species units despite equipment damage and electromagnetic interference. Her primitive radio systems worked when more advanced alien technology failed in the chaotic environment. Private Chong provided continuous intelligence updates from positions that no other species could reach. Her small size and human flexibility allowed reconnaissance that was impossible for larger, more heavily armored aliens. Captain Miller coordinated the entire evacuation with calm professionalism. He made split-second decisions that kept the retreat organized, while other officers struggled to understand the rapidly changing situation. Most impressive to Zefkar was how the human soldiers seemed to improve under pressure. While many alien units became disorganized in the chaos, the humans moved with increasing coordination and effectiveness. "All units, evacuation is complete," Captain Miller reported. Initiating reactor emergency shutdown in 60 seconds. The mixed species force had withdrawn to a ridge line 3 kilometers from the mining facility. From this distance, they could see hegemony soldiers still emerging from tunnel systems throughout the complex. The enemy had clearly invested enormous resources in the surprise attack. Reactor shutdown complete. Private Chong reported from her position near the facility's power systems. Enemy forces are trapped inside with no power and no communications. Zefkar stared at the tactical display, showing the facility's status. The humans had turned the mining complex into a prison for the hegemony assault force. Instead of losing the battle, they had eliminated hundreds of enemy soldiers through strategic thinking rather than firepower. "How long have you been planning this contingency?" Commander Vextar asked Captain Miller. "Since we arrived, sir," Miller replied. "Standard human doctrine is to prepare for mission failure at every level. We studied the facility layout and identified multiple scenarios where evacuation would be necessary." The Valtorian felt embarrassed by his earlier dismissal of human capabilities. While he had focused on creating a perfect defensive plan, they had prepared for imperfection. While he had assumed superior firepower would guarantee victory, they had planned for tactical adaptation. "Enemy main fleet will arrive tomorrow," Commander Vextar continued. "Without the mining facility, our defensive position is compromised." "Actually, sir," Lieutenant Rodriguez said quietly, "losing the facility might work in our favor. We've been monitoring hegemony communications since yesterday. They're expecting to find their assault force in control of the complex." Captain Miller nodded. The surprise attack was supposed to secure the facility before their main fleet arrived. Now they'll find their advanced force trapped and the complex abandoned. Their entire battle plan just collapsed. Zefkar began to understand that the humans hadn't just salvaged a disaster. They had potentially turned it into a strategic advantage. The enemy's careful planning was now working against them. As the night continued, Zefkar observed the human soldiers preparing for the next phase of battle. They showed no frustration about losing the facility, no panic about facing the enemy fleet with reduced resources. Instead, they worked methodically to adapt their tactics to the new situation. The Valtorian was beginning to realize that his assumptions about human military capabilities had been completely wrong. These weren't primitive soldiers struggling with inferior equipment. They were adaptable warriors who excelled in exactly the kind of chaotic, unpredictable combat that paralyzed other species. Tomorrow would bring the main hegemony fleet, and Zefkar was starting to suspect that the humans had been preparing for that battle as well. The hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace 18 hours ahead of schedule, filling the star system with 67 warships that blocked out the light from Kepler 442b's sun. Zefkar stood at the portable command station on the ridge overlooking the abandoned mining facility, watching the tactical displays as enemy vessels moved into attack formation. Fleet composition includes 12 heavy cruisers, 38 destroyers, and 17 support vessels, reported the ethereal sensor officer. Total enemy strength is approximately 40,000 soldiers. Commander Vextar studied the holographic display, showing the massive enemy fleet. "Our evacuation transports won't arrive for another 6 hours. We have 800 defenders against 40,000 attackers. The numbers were impossible. Even with superior defensive positions, no military force could survive those odds. Zefkar felt his crystalline skin grow cold as he calculated the tactical situation. The Joint Defense Force was facing complete annihilation. "Sir," Captain Miller approached the command station. "Request permission to implement Emergency Protocol 12. "What is Emergency Protocol 12? Commander Vextar asked. Lieutenant Rodriguez consulted her datapad. Complete communications blackout, except for emergency channels. All units switched to predetermined fallback positions using manual navigation only. Zefkar was confused by this request. Why would they want to limit communications just as the main battle was beginning? Coordination between different species would be essential for any hope of survival. The hegemony will jam all standard communication frequencies once they begin their attack, Sergeant Johnson explained. If we're already operating under communications blackout, their jamming won't disrupt our coordination. Private Chong added quietly. Also, sir, the reactor overload in the mining facility will create electromagnetic pulse effects in approximately 4 hours. Our hardened communication systems will still work, but most enemy electronics will be temporarily disabled. Zefkar stared at the young human soldier. Reactor overload? The facility was shut down safely. The shutdown was designed to look safe, sir, Chong replied. But the containment fields are slowly degrading. When they fail, the resulting explosion will eliminate the trapped hegemony forces and create an electromagnetic dead zone for several hours. The Valtorian realized that the humans had been planning this disaster from the moment they evacuated the facility. What had appeared to be emergency damage control was actually a carefully orchestrated trap. How long have you been planning this? Zefkar asked, his admiration mixed with growing concern about human tactical thinking. Since we arrived and saw the tunnel system, sir, Captain Miller answered honestly. We identified the reactor overload scenario as our best option for dealing with superior enemy force. Commander Vextar looked between the human officers and the tactical display, showing the approaching fleet. You're telling me that you plan to destroy the facility we were sent to defend? Yes, sir, Miller replied calmly. The mining equipment can be replaced. The rare metals are still in the ground. But if the hegemony establishes a base here, they'll threaten the entire sector. The logic was sound, but Zefkar felt disturbed by the casual way humans planned for acceptable losses. They were willing to sacrifice their primary objective to achieve a larger strategic goal. Over the next 2 hours, the hegemony fleet moved into orbital bombardment positions. Their jamming systems activated, cutting off most communication between the joint defense units. But the human soldiers continued coordinating through their hardened radio network, guiding other species units to positions that would survive the coming bombardment. Enemy is launching ground assault transports, the ethereal sensor officer reported. 300 dropships heading for the mining facility. Zefkar watched the tactical display as hundreds of enemy vessels descended toward the planet's surface. The hegemony was concentrating their entire assault force around the abandoned mining complex, expecting to link up with their advanced troops who were actually trapped inside. All units, prepare for electromagnetic pulse in 60 seconds, Private Chong announced over the emergency communication channel. The mining facility exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire valley. The electromagnetic pulse that followed knocked out sensors across the battlefield for nearly 10 minutes. When the displays came back online, the landscape had been transformed. Where the mining complex had stood, there was now a crater half a kilometer wide. The 300 hegemony dropships that had been approaching the facility were scattered across the valley floor, their electronics fried by the electromagnetic pulse. Thousands of enemy soldiers were stranded without communication or transportation. Phase 1 complete, Captain Miller reported with professional calm. Enemy ground forces are neutralized. Orbital fleet is moving to secondary bombardment positions. Zefkar realized that the humans had just eliminated nearly half the enemy force through strategic thinking rather than direct combat. But the remaining hegemony warships were still in orbit, and they looked very angry. Incoming orbital bombardment, the sensor officer warned. All units seek immediate cover. The ridge line erupted in explosions as enemy plasma cannons fired from space. Alien soldiers dove for whatever shelter they could find among the rocky terrain. The bombardment continued for 20 minutes, turning the defensive positions into a moonscape of craters and debris. When the firing stopped, Zefkar emerged from behind a shattered boulder to see the devastating effects. More than half of the Joint Defense Force had been killed or wounded by the orbital attack. The survivors were scattered, disorganized, and completely outgunned. Status report, all units. Commander Vextar called over crackling radio network. The responses were grim. Gornak heavy weapons teams were reduced to less than half strength. Meridian infantry units had lost most of their officers. Ethereal support personnel were cut off from their equipment. The defense force was collapsing. Human units, report status, the commander requested. Miller here. We've got casualties, but all units are operational. Falling back to predetermined positions, Charlie through hotel. Rodriguez reporting. Communication network is still functional. Connecting with surviving Allied units now. Johnson here. Lost some equipment, but explosives are intact. Ready for Phase 2 operations. Chong reporting from Overwatch position. I've got eyes on enemy orbital positions and ground movements. Zefkar was amazed that the human soldiers were not only surviving the disaster, but maintaining their organization and morale. While other species units were paralyzed by the overwhelming enemy superiority, the humans seemed to be following some predetermined plan. What is Phase 2? Commander Vextar asked. Sir, the electromagnetic pulse damaged enemy orbital sensors, Lieutenant Rodriguez explained. They can't see our actual positions or numbers. We can make them think we're stronger than we really are. Over the next hour, Sergeant Johnson's explosive charges created fake weapon signatures across the ridgeline. The detonations were timed to simulate artillery fire from positions that the defenders no longer held. Private Chong used signal flares and reflective panels to create false heat signatures that looked like large military units. Captain Miller coordinated deception by having small teams move constantly between positions, creating radio chatter that suggested hundreds of soldiers where only dozens remained. The humans were making the hegemony fleet think they faced organized resistance instead of scattered survivors. Enemy is repositioning orbital assets, the sensor officer reported. They're moving to engage our fake positions. The hegemony warships began bombarding empty ridges and abandoned positions, while the actual survivors remained hidden. The deception was buying precious time for the evacuation transports to arrive. But Zefkar could see the long-term problem. Even if the humans could maintain their illusions for a few more hours, the enemy would eventually realize the truth. When that happened, the real defensive positions would be overwhelmed in minutes. Captain Miller. Zefkar approached the human officer. Your tactics are impressive, but we're still facing impossible odds. How do you maintain such confidence? Miller looked at the Valtorian with calm eyes. Sir, humans have faced impossible odds many times in our history. We've learned that impossible just means you have to think differently. But the mathematics of the situation haven't changed. Zefkar protested. We're still vastly outnumbered and outgunned. True, Miller agreed, but the enemy is making assumptions about how this battle will develop. As long as we can control their assumptions, we can control the outcome. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached with a communication update. Sir, I'm detecting unusual patterns in hegemony fleet communications. They're requesting confirmation of ground force status, but they're not getting responses. Sergeant Johnson grinned as he joined the conversation. That's because their ground forces are still unconscious from the electromagnetic pulse. The ones that survived are probably wondering why their equipment doesn't work. Private Chang's voice came over the radio from her observation position. Enemy fleet is showing signs of confusion. 3 ships have broken formation to investigate the facility crater. Zefkar began to understand that the humans weren't just buying time with their deception. They were actively disrupting enemy coordination. The hegemony commanders were making decisions based on false information, which was leading them into tactical errors. Sir, Captain Miller addressed Commander Vextar. The enemy fleet is vulnerable right now. If we had some way to exploit their confusion. The human officer's tone suggested that he had ideas about exploiting the situation, but Zefkar couldn't imagine what options remained for such a small, battered force. The evacuation transports were still 4 hours away, and the deception couldn't last much longer. Soon the hegemony would discover the true situation and finish what they had started. But as Zefkar watched the human soldiers continue their impossible mission with steady determination, he began to suspect that they had been preparing for this exact scenario as well. Captain Miller gathered the surviving officers around a portable holographic display that showed the hegemony fleet in orbit above them. The enemy warships had spread into a search pattern, looking for the ground forces that their sensors couldn't locate properly. "Commander," Miller addressed Vextar quietly, "I need to share some information that might change how you view this mission." Zefkar moved closer to hear the conversation. The human captain's tone suggested that important revelations were coming. "The defense of Kepler, 442b was never our primary objective," Miller continued. "This entire operation was designed to gather intelligence on hegemony fleet operations and command structure." Commander Vextar stared at the human officer. "You're saying this was all a setup?" "Not exactly, sir. We genuinely intended to defend the mining facility if possible. But our real mission was to study how the hegemony conducts major offensive operations. We needed to observe their tactics, command protocols, and fleet coordination under combat conditions." Lieutenant Rodriguez activated her datapad, showing communication intercepts and sensor readings. "For the past 3 days, we've been recording every hegemony transmission, scanning their ship configurations, and mapping their command network. We now have complete intelligence on their operational methods." Zefkar felt a mixture of admiration and concern. The humans had been conducting espionage, while he thought they were simply trying to survive. Their apparent mistakes and improvisations had actually been part of a larger intelligence-gathering operation. The mining facility destruction was an emergency damage control, Sergeant Johnson explained. It was bait to make the hegemony commit their full fleet to a single location. Now we have detailed scans of every ship, every weapon system, and every communication protocol they use. Private Chang's voice crackled over the radio from her observation position. "Command, I'm detecting something interesting in the enemy fleet formation. The command ship is that heavy cruiser in the center of the formation, the one with the extended sensor arrays." Miller nodded and pointed to the tactical display. "That's the intelligence we really needed. Hegemony fleets operate through centralized command. If you eliminate the command ship, the entire fleet loses coordination." Zefkar began to understand the scope of human planning. They hadn't just prepared for tactical failure. They had used apparent failure to achieve a strategic objective that was completely different from their stated mission. "So the real question," Commander Vextar said slowly, "is how do we use this intelligence? We still can't fight 67 warships with 800 survivors." Captain Miller smiled for the first time since the battle began. "Actually, sir, we don't need to fight them. We just need to get this intelligence to the Galactic Defense Council fleet that's waiting in the next star system." The holographic display changed to show a wider view of local space. 12 light-years away, a massive Defense Council fleet was positioned near a hyperspace junction point. The force included over 200 warships from various member species. "They've been waiting for our signal," Lieutenant Rodriguez explained. "Once we transmit the intelligence data, they can jump directly into the system with complete knowledge of enemy positions and capabilities." Zefkar realized that the humans had orchestrated not just a battle for Kepler, 442b, but a much larger trap involving forces across multiple star systems. The mining colony had been the bait for an operation that was far beyond anything he had imagined. "But how do we transmit through the hegemony jamming?" the Valtorian asked. "Their communication blocking extends throughout the entire system." "We don't need to transmit through it," Sergeant Johnson said, preparing his equipment packs. "We need to get above it." Private Chong descended from her observation position, carrying sensor equipment that she had been using to study the enemy fleet. The hegemony jamming uses directed energy fields that extend about 50,000 kilometers from their ships. Beyond that range, normal communications work fine. Captain Miller activated a new display showing the planet's orbital mechanics. There's an abandoned research station high orbit that's outside the jamming field. If we can reach it, we can transmit the intelligence data to the Defense Council fleet. Commander Vextar looked skeptical. "How do we reach orbital altitude with no spacecraft? All our transports were destroyed in the bombardment. "We do have spacecraft, sir," Miller replied. "The hegemony dropships that crashed during the electromagnetic pulse are scattered throughout the valley. Their electronics were damaged, but the basic flight systems should be reparable." Zeph Carr stared at the human captain in amazement. Even their most desperate escape plan relied on using enemy equipment against the enemy themselves. Over the next 2 hours, human soldiers led mixed teams into the valley to examine crashed hegemony dropships. Most of the alien vessels were too damaged to fly, but Sergeant Johnson identified 3 ships with reparable navigation and propulsion systems. "These aren't going to be comfortable flights," Johnson warned as he worked on the enemy electronics. "Hegemony life support systems are designed for insectoid physiology. Most of us will need to wear emergency suits." Lieutenant Rodriguez established communication links between the 3 dropships using human radio equipment. "We'll need to fly in formation to coordinate navigation. The enemy ship's guidance systems aren't compatible with our standard procedures." Private Chong studied the orbital mechanics data on her portable computer. "Launch window opens in 47 minutes. If we miss it, the research station won't be in position for another 6 hours." Captain Miller organized mission teams carefully. Each dropship would carry 2 human crew members plus representatives from other species who could operate the captured ship's alien technology. The remaining survivors would continue the ground-based deception to keep the hegemony fleet distracted. Zeph Carr volunteered for the orbital mission, partly from scientific curiosity about human tactics, and partly from personal shame about his earlier dismissal of their capabilities. If these soldiers could turn military disaster into strategic victory, he wanted to observe their methods firsthand. "Launch in 10 minutes, Lieutenant Rodriguez announced as the 3 captured dropships powered up with mixed human and alien technology. "Remember, we need to reach orbital altitude without the enemy fleet detecting our launch." The dropships lifted off during a coordinated explosion sequence that Sergeant Johnson had prepared to simulate another ground battle. The hegemony sensors registered the explosions as evidence of continued resistance, masking the energy signatures of the launching spacecraft. Flying in captured enemy ships was terrifying. The hegemony vessels were designed for insectoid crews, so the controls were positioned for 6-limbed operators with compound eyes. Human pilots had improvised hand and foot positions to reach critical systems while wearing bulky environmental suits. "Stay in formation," Captain Miller's voice came over the modified radio system. "Enemy sensors will identify us as their own ships returning from ground operations." The 3 dropships climbed toward orbital altitude, while the hegemony fleet continued bombarding empty positions on the planet's surface. The deception was holding, but Zeph Carr could see that some enemy ships were beginning to investigate the crash landing sites. "Research station in sight," Private Chong reported from the lead dropship, "docking in 3 minutes." The abandoned orbital facility was small and obviously hadn't been used in years, but its communication systems were outside the hegemony jamming field, and Lieutenant Rodriguez quickly established contact with the Defense Council Fleet. "Council Fleet Command, this is Kepler Defense Force," Rodriguez transmitted. "We have complete intelligence package on enemy fleet disposition and capabilities. Request immediate tactical strike." The response came back within seconds. "Defense Force, this is Admiral Chin aboard the battleship Defiance. Intelligence received and confirmed. Fleet jumping to your coordinates in 20 minutes. Zeph Carr watched through the research station's observation windows as space around Kepler, 442b suddenly filled with Defense Council warships. Over 200 vessels materialized in perfect attack formation, using the intelligence data to target specific enemy ships with devastating precision. The battle that followed lasted less than 30 minutes. The hegemony fleet, caught completely off guard by an attack that exploited all their tactical weaknesses, was destroyed almost entirely. Only 7 enemy ships escaped the system, and they were too damaged to pose any immediate threat. Captain Miller established communication with Admiral Chin as the Defense Council Fleet secured the system. "Admiral, this is Captain Miller. Mission accomplished. Enemy intelligence gathered successfully." "Outstanding work, Captain," the Admiral replied. "Your intelligence data allowed us to execute the most successful fleet engagement in recent Defense Council history." As the 3 captured dropships prepared to return to the planet's surface, Zefkar finally understood the full scope of what he had witnessed. The humans hadn't just survived an impossible military situation. They had converted defeat into one of the most significant strategic victories in galactic history, the defense of Kepler. 442b had been a complete success, but not in any way that the Valtorian could have predicted when the mission began. Captain Miller, Zefkar said as they descended toward the planet, I owe you an apology. I severely underestimated human military capabilities. Miller looked at the crystalline alien with understanding eyes. Sir, most species make the same mistake initially. Humans look weak because we don't have natural armor or enhanced physical abilities. But we've learned to compensate through planning, adaptation, and teamwork. Your people turned apparent weaknesses into tactical advantages. Zefkar observed, your need for artificial equipment made you experts at using captured enemy technology. Your verbal communication allowed coordination when telepathic links were jammed. Every species has advantages and disadvantages. Miller replied diplomatically, the key is understanding how to use what you have effectively. As the dropships landed near the surviving ground forces, Zefkar realized that his entire understanding of military capability had been transformed by watching human soldiers operate under impossible conditions. He had mocked their apparent primitiveness, but they had just executed one of the most sophisticated military operations he had ever witnessed. 3 weeks after battle at Kepler, 442b, Zefkar sat in his quarters aboard the Defense Council flagship, staring at the official report he was writing. The document would be distributed to military strategists across the galaxy, and he wanted every word to be precise. The Hegemony fleet had been completely destroyed with minimal Defense Council casualties. The mining colony could be rebuilt within 6 months. Most importantly, the intelligence gathered during the operation had revealed critical weaknesses in enemy tactics that would affect military planning for years to come. But none of those strategic achievements were what kept Zefkar awake at night. He was haunted by the memory of his own arrogance and blindness. For days before the battle, he had mocked human soldiers as primitive and weak. He had been completely, embarrassingly wrong. A soft chime indicated someone requesting entry to his quarters. Zefkar opened the door to find Captain Miller standing in the corridor, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need some caffeine, Miller said, offering one of the cups. I heard you've been working on the after-action report for 3 days straight. Zefkar accepted the coffee gratefully. Human beverages had become popular throughout the galactic community since their species joined the Defense Council. Like many things about humans, the simple drink was more complex than it initially appeared. Captain, I need to ask you something, Zefkar said as they sat down in his quarters. During the mission briefing, you knew I had dismissed your capabilities. You were aware of my prejudice from the beginning. Miller nodded calmly. It was pretty obvious, yes. Your telepathic species tend to broadcast emotional reactions even when you don't intend to. We could all sense your disdain. Then why didn't you challenge my assumptions? Why didn't you demand respect for your unit's abilities? The human captain sipped his coffee thoughtfully. What would have been the point? Arguing about it would have created conflict within the command structure. It was more productive to prove our worth through actions. Zefkar felt a wave of shame wash over his crystalline features. I was supposed to be the strategic advisor for the mission. My prejudice could have gotten everyone killed. But it didn't, Miller replied simply. And honestly, your initial tactical plan wasn't bad. It just didn't account for some possibilities that our experience had taught us to consider. You're being too generous, Zefkar protested. I completely misjudged your species' military capabilities. I assumed physical weakness meant tactical inferiority. Miller set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. You know what's interesting about human military history? We've always been the underdogs. We don't have the strongest bodies, the fastest reflexes, or the most advanced natural abilities. So we learn to win through other methods, such as adaptability, planning for failure, turning disadvantages into advantages, working together despite our differences. Miller paused. Most species develop their military tactics around their natural strengths. Humans had developed tactics that compensated for our natural weaknesses. Zefkar considered this perspective. So your apparent primitiveness was actually sophisticated adaptation to your physical limitations. Partly, yes, but it's more than that. Miller stood and walked to the window, showing the star field outside. Human history is full of situations where small, apparently weak forces defeated much larger, stronger enemies. We learned early that victory isn't always about superior firepower. What is it about then? Understanding your enemy better than they understand you, making them fight your kind of battle instead of theirs, using their assumptions against them. Miller turned back to face the Valtorian. The hegemony assumed they were fighting a conventional defensive action. We let them keep that assumption while we gathered intelligence for a completely different kind of operation. Zefkar felt impressed despite himself. Your people conducted military deception at multiple levels simultaneously. You deceive the enemy about your intentions, your capabilities, and even your basic mission objectives. That's standard human doctrine when facing superior forces, Miller explained. If you can't win through strength, you win through intelligence and misdirection. But how do you maintain morale when your plans depend on accepting failure? Your soldiers performed excellently even while losing the mining facility. Miller smiled slightly. That's probably the most important thing about human military thinking. We plan for failure, but we don't expect it. Every contingency plan is designed to turn tactical defeat into strategic advantage. I don't understand the distinction. We knew there was a good chance we'd lose the facility, Miller explained. So, we prepared ways to make losing the facility hurt the enemy more than it hurt us. When the reactor overload eliminated their ground forces, tactical defeat became strategic victory. Zefkar realized that human military thinking operated on multiple levels simultaneously. They planned for both success and failure, prepared for both expected and unexpected developments, and maintained multiple objectives that could shift based on changing circumstances. Your approach is far more sophisticated than I initially recognized, the Valtorian admitted. I mistook tactical flexibility for primitive improvisation. That's a common error, Miller replied diplomatically. Most species with natural combat advantages develop military doctrines around overwhelming force or superior technology. Humans develop doctrines around adaptability and intelligence. So when I mock your soldiers for lacking natural armor and enhanced abilities, you were measuring us by standards that don't apply to human warfare, Miller finished. It would be like us criticizing your people for being too slow and inflexible when your crystalline armor provides tremendous protection. The conversation was interrupted by another door chime. Lieutenant Rodriguez entered, carrying data pads and looking pleased. Sir, she addressed Miller, I thought you want to see the preliminary intelligence analysis from the hegemony fleet data we gathered. Miller accepted the data pad and scanned its contents. This is remarkable. The enemy command protocols are even more centralized than we suspected. A single communication disruption could paralyze their entire fleet structure. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. The data suggests that every major hegemony operation uses identical command hierarchies. If we can develop countermeasures for one fleet, we can probably use them against all their forces. Zefkar looked at the intelligence summaries with growing respect. The humans hadn't just won a single battle. They had gathered strategic intelligence that would affect the war's entire course. This information will revolutionize Defense Council tactics, he observed. Every species' military will need to study these findings. Actually, Miller said carefully, we were hoping you might help with that. Your position as strategic advisor gives you access to military commanders throughout the galactic community. You want me to distribute human tactical doctrines to other species? Not exactly, Rodriguez explained. We want to share what we learned about adaptability and multi-level planning. Human methods might not work for every species, but the principles could be valuable. Zefkar understood what they were suggesting. Instead of simply copying human tactics, other species could develop their own adaptive approaches based on their unique capabilities and limitations. I would be honored to help, he replied sincerely, though I suspect many officers will initially react the same way I did, with skepticism about human military methods. That's why your perspective is valuable, Miller said. You experience a transition from skepticism to understanding. You can explain it to others who might have similar prejudices. Over the following months, Zefkar worked with human officers to develop training programs for multi-species operations. The courses focus on adaptive thinking, contingency planning, and turning apparent disadvantages into tactical advantages. The Valtorian's final report on the Kepler 442b operation became required reading at military academies throughout the galactic community. But more importantly, his personal account of changing his mind about human capabilities sparked broader discussions about prejudice and assumption in military planning. 6 months later, Zefkar received a new assignment as liaison officer with the 1st Human Combat Division. When he reported for duty, he found several other alien officers who had requested similar positions. "Why did you volunteer for this assignment?" asked a young Meridian lieutenant who had just arrived. Zefkar looked at the human soldiers preparing for their next mission. They moved with the same calm efficiency he remembered from Kepler 442b, preparing for multiple contingencies while maintaining confidence in their abilities. "Because," the Valtorian replied, "I learned that some of the most dangerous assumptions in military planning are the ones you don't realize you're making." Captain Miller approached the group of new liaison officers with a familiar smile. "Welcome to the division. I hope you're ready for some unconventional approaches to military operations." The Meridian lieutenant looked uncertain. "Sir, we've heard that human tactics can be unpredictable." Miller nodded seriously. "That's true. We tend to do things differently than most species. But I think you'll find that different doesn't necessarily mean inferior." As the briefing began, Zefkar settled back to observe another group of alien officers learning what he had discovered at Kepler 442b. Human soldiers looked weak and primitive until you watched them turn impossible situations into strategic victories. He had mocked them as inferior warriors, but they had proven him dead wrong in ways he never could have imagined. The young Meridian leaned over to whisper, "Do you really think these humans are as capable as their reputation suggests?" Zefkar smiled, remembering his own skepticism just months before. "Lieutenant, let me give you some advice. Don't underestimate them based on appearances. Just watch, learn, and prepare to be surprised." As Captain Miller began explaining the division's next mission, Zefkar reflected on how completely his understanding of military capability had changed. The humans had taught him that true strength often appeared in unexpected forms, and that the most effective warriors were sometimes the ones who looked least dangerous. He had been arrogant enough to mock human soldiers based on superficial observations. They had been professional enough to prove their worth through actions rather than arguments. Looking back, Zefkar realized that the most important lesson from Kepler 442b wasn't about military tactics or strategic planning. It was about the danger of letting prejudice blind you to capabilities that didn't match your expectations. He had learned that lesson the hard way, but he would never forget it. And now, working alongside human soldiers on a daily basis, he had the opportunity to help other species learn it as well. The humans had turned his mockery into respect, his skepticism into admiration, and his prejudice into understanding. They had proven him dead wrong, and he was grateful for it.